But I'd like to put what we're going to talk about in context today. So we have talked about 5 topics so far. We have talked about the topic, what is addiction, drugs in the body, the recovery process, the family context, and how you help somebody else. And we've talked about healing. We've talked about healing individuals, we've talked about healing families, and we're going to talk about healing again today, but we're going to talk about healing on a different level. We're talking about healing our city, because we have a problem in Vancouver and Canada and British Columbia and quite frankly around the world with some of our fundamental attitudes of how we see drugs that create problems for us. If I think about one of the things that has been an echoing theme of this series of talks, it's the creation of the bad person. We talked about how when we go to the place of addiction in our lives, we believe that we are bad, and we talked about how that doesn't work for us. When we talked about families, we talked about how a family member will become identified as being bad, and that does not work for families. What we're going to talk about today is our city. We have a bad neighborhood, and it doesn't work for any one of us to have that as a way of being in Vancouver. So really, I'm talking about our fundamental attitudes that we have about drugs in our society are also part of the healing process. It's not just about individuals, it's not just about families, it's about all of us. So when I started this 6 weeks ago, or 6 sessions ago, I talked about the history of drug educators. We talked about how the history of drug educators was that we lied. And we've told 3 lies. We've exaggerated the harms of drugs, we've never acknowledged the benefits of drugs, and we've never talked about the harms of the dominant model to drugs in our society, which is drug prohibition. And I offered to do something different. I offered to tell the truth about drugs, where I talked about the facts of the harms of drugs and the facts of the benefits of drugs. And today we're going to talk about the facts of our dominant model for thinking about drugs, which is criminalization. So I want to ask a fundamental question here, is how do we deal with illegal drugs in Canada? And the answer to that question is best summarized in this particular graph, where we spend 70% of our tax dollars dealing with drugs through the lens of enforcement. By that I mean police, courts, border guards, prison officers. The whole enforcement industry is how we mostly respond to drugs in our society. And if you look at that little red slice of the pie, for all of those folks who say, why are you spending all that money on harm reduction? The very simple answer is, we're not. We're actually spending all that money on enforcement, not on harm reduction. So this graph you see in front of you has absolutely no evidence to support it. Absolutely none. This is an irrational approach to drugs in our society. So I want to explore what I just said. I said there's no evidence to support this. What do I mean by no evidence? I mean, I'm on faculty at UBC, and I was asked to debate a cop about this. He was an RCMP officer who was also academic. And the question they asked us was, should marijuana prohibition go up in smoke? I didn't like the question. I would have preferred to talk about all drugs, not just cannabis. But my approach was we need to end prohibition, and his approach was prohibition is a wonderful thing. And I went into the academic research, and I found 56 peer-reviewed journal articles and significant reports that basically explored the failures of an enforcement approach. And I photocopied the front page of each one of those articles, and halfway through my presentation, I put my stack of evidence in front of them, and I said, here is my evidence that this approach to drugs is completely unsuccessful. If you have one peer-reviewed journal article you could suggest to me that demonstrates the effectiveness of this approach, I would like you to tell me what it is. He looked a little embarrassed, he shuffled his feet, and he said, actually, I can't. So when I say there is no evidence to support this pie chart, I mean none. There isn't any. There is nothing that supports this particular approach to drugs in our society. This is an irrational approach to drugs. So what we're going to talk about today is a different approach. It's a public health approach to drugs in our society. The harms of drug prohibition are variable. There's lots of them. One of them is health harms. When people buy drugs on the streets of Vancouver today, they do not know the dosage, the purity, and the contaminants. For example, 80% of the cocaine on the streets of Vancouver, quite frankly, all of Canada, North America, and Europe, is contaminated. And it's contaminated with a drug called levamisole. Levamisole is horrible for the human system to smoke. It's put in source countries. It's a pig or a cattle livestock deworming agent. And it wreaks havoc on the human bloodstream when it's smoked. It creates big health problems for us. So that's just one example. There's lots of other examples of impure drugs that are floating around the streets of Vancouver. Also, people do not know the dosage that they are buying. Sometimes they are buying 5% purity, sometimes they are buying 95% purity. And when we're talking about injection drugs, that can be a significant source of fatalities in our city if people do not know what they're going to inject before they inject it. Another health harm that drug prohibition does is it takes money away from the healthcare system. Every dollar spent on the taken out of the tax pot and spent on enforcement is a dollar that is not spent on health. That means there are waiting lists for all addiction services throughout the city, probably throughout the province. We didn't seem to learn a lot from our experience with alcohol prohibition. At the end of alcohol prohibition, what we had was widely available, strong, concentrated, toxic alcohol. Why was it widely available? Well, because people wanted to buy it, and if people want to buy it, people will sell it to make a buck. Why was it strong and concentrated? Why could you not purchase beer or wine during alcohol prohibition? Well, the answer is smugglers want small packages. If you have a choice of a barrel of beer or a box of whiskey and you are clandestine, you will choose the box of whiskey. It was also often toxic. You could buy methyl alcohol, you could buy ethyl alcohol. It was contaminated with all kinds of things, including creosote to give it the right color. And that was a problem back then. If people drank it, they would occasionally go blind. It's a problem today because people have no idea what they're purchasing. It's often completely toxic. So what we have today is exactly the same as what we had at the end of alcohol prohibition. What we had then was strong, concentrated, toxic alcohol controlled by violent criminals. What we have today is strong, concentrated, often toxic, currently illegal drugs controlled by violent criminals. We are replaying history again. There is also an infectious disease mess that happens with currently illegal drugs, specifically HIV and hepatitis C, significant health problems for people who acquire these illnesses. And there is nothing about currently illegal drugs that attracts HIV and Hep C. The only reason why people experience those diseases is because we do not control the context of those drugs in our society. One of the problems with prohibition as a fundamental viewpoint to see drugs through is it becomes very simple. We get very simple black and white sound bites. And so we see there's been good drugs and bad people taking bad drugs. And we can't look at the nuances. We can't look at the subtleties. And the truth of the matter is, as I've said before, any drug can be used and any drug can be abused depending on the context of use. You can abuse caffeine, you can abuse aspirin, and any drug can be used. And it all depends on how it's taken, why it's taken, and the context of the use. So when we look at it through that lens, when we look at the nuances, when we look at how we could actually use drugs, we see them very differently. In the old model, things like psychedelics were bad drugs. When we look at it through the new model, we see that there are actually significant potentials for harm and benefit. And we're allowed to have that discussion. I'm really interested in things like ibogaine. Ibogaine is a drug that seems to be incredibly helpful for addictions. And we haven't been able to have that discussion because of how it's classified, which is a psychedelic. And I think that we need to be able to move beyond that discussion and simply be able to look at the evidence. The evidence should guide our discussion, not fear-based sound bites, which is what guides our discussion today. Inevitably, when an illegal market gets created, what happens is it becomes a violent process. It was violent during alcohol prohibition, and it's violent today during drug prohibition. When people enter the drug trade, they have disputes with their comrades, with their fellow business people, in the same way that disputes happen between regular business people. If you opened up a factory that was making widgets that looked a lot like the widgets made in my factory that was across the street from you, I would go to, first of all, my people would talk to your people. If that didn't work, my lawyers would talk to your lawyers, and if that didn't work, we would ask a judge to decide whether your widgets were legal widgets or not, and that was how we would resolve the conflict between the two of us. People who work in the illegal drug industry don't have access to that particular conflict dispute mechanism process, so they still have disputes, and they solve it by violence. And so what we see in the newspapers are things like this. Brace for gang war. The police warn there will be shootings as a gang called the Independent Soldiers battles with rivals, including the UN gang and the Hells Angels, for their share of BC's lucrative drug trade. This particular one had an impact on me because when I was doing a presentation, somebody showed up who witnessed this event. He had a place that overlooked Oak Street, and he said he heard some gunfire in the middle of the night. He was fast asleep. He thought it was a movie. Movie guns is kind of what he associated with it. So he stumbled over to the window, half asleep, and he looked out and he realized this is not a movie. What he saw is lots of guys with assault rifles shooting each other. And so he did a very smart thing. He went and he hid. And he waited. And he waited for a long period of time as they went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this whole explosion of violence happened. And then eventually it calmed down. And eventually, the police came. And he went back and he looked out. And what he saw was assault rifles and bodies on the street. And the police described it as completely outrageous. That actually is a public health problem. Bullets are a health problem in the city of Vancouver. And it's not just bad guys killing bad guys. Also, innocent people get killed in the process. Here was a gas fireplace technician. He was on his knees fixing a fireplace. And he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was killed in the process. In this particular incident, a neighbor was also killed who just happened to be leaving his apartment and wrong time, wrong place. There are social consequences of drug prohibition. For example, 29% of the women in jail are there on a drug offense, and 2/3 of them have children under the age of 18. I am a father. I believe that my dad role is maybe the most important thing I do on the planet. Fathers cannot be good fathers when they're in jail. Mothers cannot be good mothers when they're in jail. It just simply doesn't happen. Here is an image. It's the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, saying, we need our daddy back, please. This particular report came from parents in Australia. And they wrote a report, and the title of the report says it all. The prohibition of illicit drugs is killing and criminalizing our children, and we are all letting it happen. So parents should stand up and object really loudly to this process because it simply isn't working for any of us. So the process of drug prohibition produces an intense level of violence on the streets of Vancouver. It produces impure drugs that are widely available and of completely unknown dosage that create significant health and social problems. So I want to ask a different question. I want to ask the question, does prohibition work? What I've talked about is the health and social harms that it does to us, but I haven't asked a fundamental question, does it work? No. Is it so incredibly successful at protecting us from the harms of these nasty, evil drugs that we need it and we need to just tolerate the harms that it does to our society because it works so well? So if we were actually a scientist and we wanted to ask that question formally, what we would do is we'd say, what are the objectives? What would we measure in order to figure out whether it works or not? And the things that we would measure, I believe, should be that drug prohibition should decrease the availability of drugs. It should increase the price of drugs. It should prevent the use of drugs. It should deter people from entering the drug trade, and it should improve the health of individuals and society. Because I like quotes, here's an interesting quote. Drug policies must be pragmatic. They must be assessed on their actual consequences, not on whether they send the right, the wrong, or mixed messages. So let's look at these various aspects of our society to see if it actually does work. Let's talk about availability first. Does drug prohibition reduce the availability of drugs? The short answer is no. It's easier and faster to get an illegal drugs delivered to your home than it is to get a pizza. You can get a pizza delivered to your door faster in Vancouver than you can get, did I say that right? No, you can get cocaine delivered to your door faster than you get a pizza in Vancouver because they have to cook the pizza first. So drugs are widely available. High schools, this disturbs my parent soul. High schools are primary distribution points for drugs in our society. I think that should be of concern to all parents. Teenagers tell us that cannabis is easier to purchase than alcohol and tobacco. With alcohol and tobacco, you have to do some kind of scamming thing with ID or persuade some adult to purchase it for you. But people who sell illegal drugs never ask for age ID. It never happens. Another sad truth is all jails have drugs in them. In fact, there were so many drugs in the jails of British Columbia that there was a gang war that was on to try and control the drug trade inside the prison bars. If the tools of drug prohibition do not work when we have men locked in cages, men and women locked in cages, those same tools will never work on the streets. Another clue that drugs are widely available comes from this huge report in the States called the Monitoring the Future Report. It's huge, and it's representative of all American students. North, South, East, West, and Central. New York to California, Maine to Mississippi. It's everywhere, and even Central, it's everywhere. So this is a representative study. So if you look at this graph, on the left-hand side, you see the red line is halfway between 80 and 100. I'm going to say that's 90. So 90% of all grade 12 students, which is what the red line is, say that cannabis is fairly easy or very easy to obtain. On the right-hand graph, the red line is halfway between 40 and 60. I'm going to say that's 50. That's half. Half of all American grade 12 students say that cocaine and crack cocaine are fairly easy or very easy to obtain. And again, it's not just the States. This is true in Canada. Here's a piece of research that said that it takes minutes to buy crystal meth. I think that's a problem. Prohibition does not increase drug prices. If it was successful, what we would see is slowly as they spend more money on this process of drug prohibition, what we would get is drug prices would go up. And exactly the opposite has happened. Here is the price per pure gram of heroin since 1981, which was the year that Nixon declared the war on drugs. So since 1981, the price per pure gram of heroin has slowly become cheaper. Maybe it's just heroin. Well, no, it's also cocaine. Here is the price per pure gram of cocaine has also got steadily cheaper. Now, I have worked for the addiction services in Vancouver for the last close to 30 years. And I have seen exactly the same thing. Slowly, the price of drugs on the streets of Vancouver has become cheaper. So we have a rather bizarre intersection of two facts. The ascending line that's going up from the left to the right on this graph is the process of incarceration in the United States. The descending line that's going down from the left to the right is the price of drugs. So these are American numbers, but what we can see from this graph that has been described as one of the most embarrassing graphs for the DEA in the history of the world, this graph shows that massive incarceration has happened at the same time that drugs has got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, which is a pretty significant clue that this particular process is not working well for any one of us. It's interesting to look at the Americans, because the Americans are a country that have incarcerated more people per capita than any other country has in the history of the planet Earth. No other country has so used the tools of incarceration against their civilians. And so it's interesting to see how this country that has taken this drug war to its extreme, it's interesting to see how it has actually, what it's achieved in their country. Because this is a chart that shows international drug use rates. And it puts the United States on a graph with all European countries that are a part of the European Union. And so it shows a whole variety of different countries, and it shows the United States. And what you see is the United States is right near the top of the pile. So here is another significant clue that massive enforcement approaches to drugs don't work very well for any one of us. Here is a very interesting study that took years to do, and it was done by the World Health Organization, and they asked a very simple question. What is the impact of drug laws on drug use rates? And they looked around the globe at many different countries, and they came up with a one-sentence conclusion. Globally, drug use is not distributed evenly and is not simply related to drug policy, since countries with stringent user-level illegal drug policies do not have lower levels of use than countries with liberal ones. So that is a very clear statement that this process is not working for anyone. I would like to talk about the solution. So far, we've really talked about the problem. The problem is our dominant approach that we have to drugs in our society, which is to criminalize people and to engage people in the criminal justice system. When I think about everything that we've said over the last series of 6 lectures, I've talked about how addiction is an attachment disorder. I've talked about how when we go to the place of addiction, we become really disconnected. We become disconnected from family, we become disconnected from friends, we become disconnected from community, we become disconnected from neighbors. And we talked about how that's a problem. And then we talked about how you help somebody else, and we talked about the problem of disconnection. When you're trying to help somebody, it's very difficult to help somebody if you don't have some sense of connection with them. So taking that kind of theme, the theme of the problem with drugs is actually a problem with disconnection, when we start to look at it through the lens of policies, what we do is we have created disconnection on a social level. When we are chasing people around with the police as a society, what we produce is even more disconnected people. When we send people to jail, we do not teach people how to relate to their neighbors in a concrete and positive way. In fact, what we teach is all kinds of nasty behaviors. In fact, jail is crime school for exactly the same 3 reasons why Harvard Law is upper crust training school. 3 things happen in jail that happen in Harvard Law School. 1 is you learn some stuff. 2 is you're constantly told who you are. And 3 is you make connections. So people who go to jail, people who go over Harvard Law, graduate to become very successful lawyers and leaders of our society. People who graduate from jail become more skillful criminals. And they become more disconnected. The whole process of disconnection just continues through the process. So the solution has to be something about connections on a social level. So it's interesting to look at the first word on the front door of Insight. Insight is our facility where we let people inject currently illegal drugs. And it is a harm reduction program. The first word on the front door of Insight is welcome. We are welcoming people into this facility, and we are welcoming people who have sometimes never been welcomed anywhere in their lives. In fact, some of the people that go to Insight were not welcome at their birth. So we as a society have to figure out how to engage and include people. We need to figure out how to participate with people. We need to figure out how to empower people. And the police don't do a very good job of that. Insight does a much better job. Insight is an engaging process. People who walk into Insight are welcomed into this facility. Notice how it looks. It looks like a healthcare facility. It's not a crack house. There's no mattresses in the rooms. There's no graffiti. It's not a mess. It's a clean healthcare facility where people are told that they are important and special and they are cared about. And through that process of inclusion and caring, people get healthier. That's an appropriate response to drugs in our society. An inappropriate response to drugs in our society is chasing people around with handcuffs. In fact, it just makes the whole thing worse. Another study that was done, or a study that was done, which really helped to illuminate this particular issue, was the Naomi study. We in Vancouver gave hardcore heroin addicts heroin. And we did it for an 18-month period for any one particular individual, and we called it the Naomi Study, which is the North America Opiate Medication Initiative. And we took daily intravenous heroin users and we gave them pure heroin in a facility where, again, they were cared about. Now, it's interesting to look at. Oh, it also happened in 2 cities. It wasn't just Vancouver, but it happened in 2 cities, Vancouver and Montreal. So it was representative of Canadians. Now, it's interesting to look at what they discovered. On the left-hand side of this graph, you see a blue and a black bars. The blue is methadone maintenance treatment, and the black is DAM, diacetylmorphine. So it's comparing methadone versus heroin. And what we see on the left-hand side of this graph is that retention was higher for folks when they were given heroin than when they were given methadone. Now, that actually isn't rocket science. What we know about people who really like heroin is they will prefer it to methadone any single time. So the retention is absolutely better, and that way, actually, we could have predicted in advance. The graph on the right is a little less clear, because what it said is people on heroin responded better than people on methadone. So when we start to see drugs through a different light, and instead of just criminalizing, actually actively working with people who are on these drugs in a constructive and positive way, what we can see is they get better. So heroin, when used constructively with heroin addicts, actually helped improve their social lives, their health statistics, their criminality, their housing. Generally speaking, these folks got better. So here we have the big bad drug. By some of us in our society say that heroin is the big bad drug. And yet what this shows you is given to the right people at the right time can produce significant benefits. So we fundamentally need to rethink this. We need to have a different discussion in our society about drugs. So I'd like to kind of reflect that I believe that the discussion started during the Summer of Love in 1969, when Life magazine said marijuana, at least 12 million Americans have tried it, are the penalties too severe, and should it be legalized? Then again, in May 1988, Time magazine said, should drugs be made legal? The Economist said, bring drugs within the law, May 1993. The Economist again, the case for legalizing drugs in August 2001. The National Review, which is a right-wing American Christian fundamentalist conservative magazine, had as their cover shot, Going to Pot, the growing movement toward ending America's irrational marijuana prohibition. Here is the Cannabis Health magazine with Libby Davis, who's a downtown East Side politician for the NDP party in Ottawa, who is demanding an investigation into how cannabis was made available to people. We have Larry Campbell, who was an RCMP officer, and then the Vancouver City Coroner, and then our mayor, and now he's in Ottawa, and he has said the same thing all the way along. And now as a senator, he says, legalize it and tax the hell out of it. So he's been consistent in his messaging. And then we have the Foreign Policy magazine, Legalize It, Why It's Time to Just Say No to Prohibition. The National Post, Put the Gangs Out of Business, Legalize Drugs. And then The Independent, Legalize All Drugs, the Chief Constable demands the end to immoral laws. The Economist again, How to Stop the Drug Wars, March 2009. This one I liked because I liked the language. The Vancouver Sun, the war on drugs has become a war against us. Historically, the way that we've thought about drugs is drugs has been us and drugs has been them. And mainstream society has treated drug users as them. And we've justified a lot of social abuses based on that us and them philosophy. And here is a headline that says the war on drugs has become a war against us, not a war against them. I think that's a really important framework. It really is just us that we are taking care of. It's our brothers, our sisters, our parents, our children, our neighbors, our fellow citizens. This particular report was the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and it was written by the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, the former presidents of Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, the former Prime Minister of Greece, the former US Secretary of State, and many other world-leading intellectuals. And the first sentence of this report is the war on drugs has failed. And the rest of the report is a condemnation of the process of criminalizing drugs. It says very clearly it doesn't work and it will never work. There is a local process going on under the banner of Stop the Violence BC, where the mayors of all cities in this province have got together and talked about this, and they have decided to support the process of cannabis legalization as a result of this process. There are 4 former BC attorneys general who would like to lend their voices to change and support the legalization of cannabis. We then have the group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is LEAP. And LEAP is now over 55,000 ex-cops, border guards, prison guards, people who've worked in the enforcement industry, and they have all joined their voices together to say the process of drug prohibition does not work for any one of us, including the cops. It's interesting to look at the evidence for change. And one of the most significant pieces of evidence that not many people talk about very often, which is Portugal. The Portuguese in 2001 essentially decriminalized all drug use. The Portuguese before that date had a huge drug problem. And what they eventually decided was they could not solve their drug problem using the tools of enforcement. They wanted instead to use the tools of health. And so what they did is they took the money out of enforcement and they put it into health interventions. But they couldn't do that unless they changed their drug laws. So they basically decided that no people can get busted for drug crimes in Portugal. And any analysis of that change indicates benefit. In fact, HIV went down, Hep C went down, overdose death rates went down, and the one that got me the most was drug use in the youth went down when it was going up in surrounding countries. So here is a country that has boldly changed its drug policies towards a health-based approach, and it's had a profound benefit for the people in the country. If I had one graph to show you, the graph would be this. What this says is on the bottom, the different ways that drugs can be regulated or worked with are on the bottom, and there's a whole variety of different options, and that's plotted against the health and social problems that drugs cause. So notice on the left-hand side of this, if we just prohibit drugs, what we do is we produce a system that maximizes harm, and it's run by illegal market gangsterism. If we did the right-hand side and we legalized all drugs with very few restrictions, what we would wind up with a system that is run by corporate profit. And we would also maximize the harms. We know that from our experiences with alcohol and tobacco. So the answer is actually somewhere in the middle. And the middle is where the U-curve goes down to its least. So if you want to minimize health and social problems in our society, you use a public health approach to regulate and control currently illegal drugs. So I've talked quite a bit about the harms of prohibition, but I would also like to talk about the harms of the right-hand side of this graph, which is the corporate agenda harms. So let's talk a little bit about alcohol, and let's talk a bit about tobacco. And in order to do that, I would like to show you some images. So what do we have here? We have a very glamorous woman stepping out of a very expensive car. Her picture is being taken. She's decked out with jewelry, and she's smoking a drug that when used as directed will kill you, and the text says, "Your ticket to a world of sophistication and style." What we have here is muscular young rock climbers who, if you look at the back snow at the top center in the middle of winter with no wetsuits on, climbing with kayaks on their backs, and they are promoting a drug that when used as directed creates lip cancers, throat cancers, mouth cancers that are very, very disfiguring. It's a horrible problem to have. And this is a product that is promoting that. Or this is an image that is promoting that. Now, if anybody doesn't know what 420 means, 420 is universal slang for it's time to smoke a joint. It's cannabis friendly. If you see an advertisement in the paper for a 420 friendly roommate, you better know how to roll a joint. So it's common. It's used in many countries around the world. And it's certainly used frequently in Vancouver. And it's interesting that the Shaftesbury Beer Company claimed they didn't know that. They claimed it had nothing to do with that at all. I think they're lying. I think essentially what this is called cross-marketing. This is the intention to sell one drug to another, to a drug-using group. This is the intent to sell alcohol to people that smoke cannabis. So it's cross-marketing. Now, if this doesn't persuade you that cross-marketing exists, I would like you to reflect on this image here. Now, I don't know what you see in this image, but I'm going to tell you what I see. I see a line of white powder. In fact, somebody observed recently a line of white powder and two nostrils. Now, I'm not sure about the second part of that, but certainly I do see a line of white powder. Now, I actually think this is cross-marketing. I think this is taking one drug-using group and trying to sell them another drug. White gold, Canadian Club. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, and that isn't an example of cross-marketing. Then I'll give you another one. How about this one? Virtual Ecstasy, which is sold in Alberta liquor stores, and it contains rum, triple sec, and sambuca. I think this is cross-marketing. Now, what do we have here? Let me tell you what I see. I see a very sexy body, dominant and in control, and she is consuming a drug that Shakespeare said increases the desire but decreases the performance. This is an illusion. And why would you settle for just one sexy body when you can ask the question that Polygamy Porter asks, why have just one? Polygamy Porter is sold in Utah. Why have just one? Now, I would like to show you a train wreck waiting to happen. In each one of these 23-ounce cans that are decked out to look like candy mints, and they're in candy mint flavors, they're targeting youth. In each one of these cans is the equivalent of 4 beer, 3 cups of coffee, and 60 grams of sugar. If you drink 2 of these, you've drunk the equivalent of 8 beers, 6 cups of coffee, and 120 grams of sugar. Yes, and it's aimed at youth. This is a problem in a profound way. What I have shown you are absolute fantasies. I have shown you illusions. There are powerful illusions that have an agenda. And the agenda of these illusions is to increase consumption. It's corporate profit that drives these illusions. So my message is, using that particular system would be a huge problem for all of us if we gave currently illegal drugs to them, because they weave a lot of fantasies that are destructive for all of our society. So what we need to talk about is the issue of regulation, not the issue of legalization, which is the corporate agenda. It's the issue of regulation. Now, I'd like to acknowledge that there are really 2 foundations to the regulatory model. One is a public health approach, and I speak for that particular perspective. But I want to acknowledge that the human rights approach also should be at the table. The human rights approach, for example, is the pivot group of lawyers in the downtown east side who advocate for people who are being abused in the downtown east side. So the human rights folks, or drug-using groups, are another example of a human rights group. So those folks should also be at the table discussing what they see in terms of this whole process. But I tend to talk about public health. So this is a public health approach to currently illegal drugs, but human rights is important in the equation. If you want to look at public health in more depth, here is a really interesting book. It's called A Plague of Prisons, The Epidemiology of Mass Incarceration in America, where Ernie Drucker asked a very simple question. If we look through the lens of public health at the number of people that are in jail in the United States, what do we see? And he came up to some very interesting and revealing answers. So I want to explore what public health tools could be used to regulate the market for currently illegal drugs. Now, public health tool number 1, looking at it, is the issue of branding. If I look at these 2 images, the image on the left is convenient, colorful, almost has a logo on it, fits in a shirt pocket, looks a whole lot like another drug that we know only too well. The image on the right is the image of medicine. It's not colorful, it's not logoized, there's no big brand names on it, it is inconvenient as a product. These are two completely separate messages. The image on the left is the corporate message. The image on the right is the health message. So if there's one thing to learn from our experience with alcohol and tobacco, it's that if we allow branding to occur, corporations will advertise them. We cannot prevent it. So the issue isn't stopping advertising, it's stopping branding. So we could restrict products in a whole lot of different ways. The branding could be prohibited. The design of the package could be controlled. It could have huge warning labels on it. The amount per package, the formulation, and the concentration of the product could be controlled. It could be registered and approved in advance, and all of the ingredients on the package could be labeled. It's of interest to me that we still don't have ingredient labeling on products like tobacco. I would like to acknowledge the source of the next 3 slides. They were put together by the City of Vancouver, who really wanted to engage the citizens in Vancouver in this discussion. And they've graciously allowed me to use these slides. And what they said is if we really want to understand our choices, it's best to look first at what choices we have. What's in our toolbox today under the label of criminalization? And what they said is today that we can use enforcement, and we can do education and awareness, and we can do social stigmatization through criminalization, and we can do treatment and harm reduction. At which point our toolkit runs dry. We don't have anything else that we can do because of our limitations set up by the enforcement paradigm. If we looked at it through the lens of public health and we just looked at what tools we would get to use, and if we started by looking at cannabis and went through our list of options, we could restrict based on age. If we wanted to, we could restrict based on age, the way we do with alcohol and tobacco today, which is either 18 or 19, depending on the province. We could restrict based on degree of intoxication. We currently have a Liquor Licensing Act that says that we won't sell to people who are intoxicated. We could use that as a tool as well. We could restrict based on volume, which is what they do in the Netherlands, where people will only be able to buy a couple of grams, which is not enough to smuggle in huge volumes across the border. It kind of controls the flow of it. We could limit places to use, which we already do. It's called pubs for beer and wine and spirits. It's called groups of people who cluster in rainy alleyways for tobacco, and it's called insight for heroin and cocaine. We could have required training prior to use. If you want to buy a firearm in this province legally, you have to sign up for a safety training program, and then you get a license to buy a firearm. We could have maximum volumes for purchase and possession. We could have training of the supplier of the product. We could have monitoring of use while driving. We could have the illegal dealers pursued by enforcement. We could have retail outlets licensed and limited. We could have the appearance of them controlled to, quite frankly, make them look boring. We could tax the hell out of them, which is what Larry Campbell keeps saying. We could have the licensing location and opening hours of the consumption facilities controlled. We could have social controls. We could have prevention programs. We could have treatment programs. We could have plain packaging and no branding. We could have warning labels and no advertising or event sponsorship. If I think about what we could do with heroin, we have even more tools that we could use. We could control based on age, degree of intoxication, volume rationing. We could have limited places to use. We could have required training prior to purchase. We could have registration of purchasers to allow for brief health contact and education. We could have licensing of users. We could have tracking of consumption habits. We could have drugs consumed at the location of sale. We could have prescription only. We could have maximum volumes for purchase and possession. We could train the supplier. We could have illegal use while driving monitored. We could have illegal dealers pursued by enforcement. We could have retail outlets licensed and limited. We could have required membership in a group prior to use. We could have stop purchase orders. We already do that. If you want to be banned from a gambling establishment, you can have your photograph put up at the front door and they won't let you in. We could have previously negotiated limits where people agree in advance how much they're allowed to purchase. We could have the appearance of the retail outlets controlled. We could have a pharmacy specialist required. We get price and profit controls. We could tax the hell out of it. We could have licensing, location, and opening hours of consumption facilities controlled. We could have social controls, prevention programs, treatment available, plain packaging, concentration of product restricted and labeled. We could have warning labels, no advertising or event sponsorship, and clean needles and health information provided with purchase. So what I've just finished saying is we have a lot more choices available to us if we see drugs through the lens of health than if we see drugs through the lens of enforcement. It's interesting what I've just done, though. I have just rattled off a whole bunch of what I would call administrative controls. Now, I'm really interested in a cross-cultural historical analysis of drug use. I'm interested in drug use around the world today and throughout human history. And what I observe is if there's a community, a society, or a group that has a benign relationship with a drug at some point in history or around the world today, they do not use everything I've just talked about. What they use are social controls, not administrative controls. There are 3 examples of social controls. For example, coffee break, wine only with food, and no alcohol with breakfast are called social norms. There are social rituals, where the drug use is structured as to what people do. Things like the Japanese tea ceremony and cocoa leaf rituals are ritualistic drug use. If we add a sacred element to the top of that, then what we get is sacred rituals, the 2 examples being the peyote ritual and the ayahuasca ritual. Those are the tools. Social controls have been used by societies from the beginning of time to control what people use, how they use it, and how they behave when they are using it. And I observe that when our society does drug prohibition, we destroy our ability to intervene using social controls because drug use becomes clandestine. So what I am suggesting is that we actually move back, and we go back to the original reasons or the original techniques used by all cultures throughout history, which is development of social controls. I'm not suggesting massive change all at once. I'm suggesting incremental change, which would allow for data collection and responding to the evidence, to have a system that is actually based on science and evidence, as opposed to our current system, which is based on fear-based sound bites. We could have information sharing with a very scared public. And we could have a slow phasing in while the illegal market is monitored. And the changes could stop at the point when the illegal market is as small as we would like it to be. What we would assess is access to youth should go down. Currently, our current system maximizes engagement of youth. And we should set up a system that makes it harder for youth to buy drugs. Health and social problems should go down, and crime rates should go down in the new system. If you're a scientist, that's probably what you'll start measuring first. What we could incrementally change is we could incrementally change drug type. Now, cannabis has the most popular support. Personally, I think we should start with smokable or injectable stimulants because they have the most significant health impacts on us all. We could incrementally change preparation. We could start with a weak oral solution of a drug, and we could slowly make it stronger, a little bit at a time, as we measured the size of the illegal market, and we could stop when the illegal market is as small as we would like it to be. We could incrementally change the degree of intrusiveness. We could start with all of those administrative techniques that I suggested before, and we could incrementally back off as we moved towards more social controls, and then we could stop when the illegal market was as small as we would like it to be. We could incrementally change the location. I can think of one neighborhood I'd like to start with, and we could expand it from there. We could incrementally change the cost of drugs. We could start out really expensive and slowly make them cheaper as we measure the size of the illegal market, and we could stop when the illegal market is as small as we would like it to be. We could incrementally change the order, delivery, delay time. We could start where you order the drug today and it's delivered 48 hours later, and then 24 hours later, and 12 hours later, and 6 hours later, and 4 hours later, and 2 hours later, as we measure the size of the illegal market, and we could stop when the illegal market is as small as we would like it to be. And where possible, we would move from administrative controls to social controls, because those are the techniques that have been used by all cultures on the planet since the beginning of recorded history. This graph says